New Guinea, 1943, night. The jungle does not sleep. It breathes. Rain has stopped, but the ground still drips, slow. Uneven drops falling from leaves so thick they swallow the sky. There is no horizon, only darkness layered upon darkness. Somewhere ahead, a narrow Japanese supply track cuts through the terrain. Not a road, not a path in the Western sense. Just compressed earth, shaped by repeated movement, porters, small carts, scattered patrols carrying ammunition and food toward forward positions deeper inland. 6 Australian soldiers move through it. No radio crackle breaks the silence. No artillery coordinates wait behind them. No backup forces approaching over the ridgeline. Only what they carry, and what they choose to do with it. They stop short of the track. One kneels, pressing fingers into wet soil. Another listens, not for sound, but for rhythm. Movement in jungle is never silent. Even logistics has a voice. Footsteps, shifting loads, the faint creak of wood under pressure. They are not here to hold ground. They are here to interrupt it. Then somewhere beyond the darkness, a convoy is expected to pass before dawn. Supplies destined for forward Japanese positions already under pressure from Allied advances along the coast. If that flow breaks, even briefly, the effect will travel further than this small strip of jungle. The patrol leader raises a hand. Not a signal of attack. A signal of understanding. They are in position, and the jungle is about to change shape around them. 2. Context/background. Section 1. By mid-1943, the war in the Pacific had entered a phase defined less by rapid conquest and more by endurance. The early Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia had stalled. The vast distances of the Pacific, combined with increasing Allied industrial output, had shifted momentum. But in places like New Guinea, momentum meant little. The war here was not measured in fronts or lines. It was measured in tracks cut through jungle, rivers crossed under fire, and supply routes that determined whether isolated units could survive another week. New Guinea itself was a logistical contradiction. Mountain ranges rose abruptly from the coastal swamps. Rainfall was constant in many regions, turning paths into mud and riverbeds into barriers. Air support existed, but visibility often did not. Maps were incomplete. Even basic terrain intelligence could be outdated within days. For Japanese forces, especially elements of the Japanese 18th Army under Hatazo Adachi, survival depended on movement through this terrain using extremely limited logistics infrastructure. Heavy equipment was rare in forward zones. Supply lines relied heavily on foot porters, small convoys, and river crossings that could be disrupted with minimal force. This created a fragile system. One broken segment could delay entire forward positions. One lost track could isolate multiple units. The Japanese defensive strategy in New Guinea was not built on overwhelming firepower. It was built on dispersed resistance, holding terrain long enough to exhaust Allied advances, while relying on concealment and mobility to avoid decisive engagement. But as Allied intelligence improved, that system became increasingly vulnerable. By 1943, Allied forces had begun shifting from broad frontal assaults to more targeted disruption strategies. Instead of only capturing territory, they increasingly focused on breaking the structure that supported enemy positions. Supply routes, communication lines, and forward staging points. This shift was not theoretical. It emerged from necessity. Large-scale operations in jungle terrain were slow. They consumed resources, and they often failed to produce decisive results because the enemy could simply withdraw deeper into the environment. So attention turned to something smaller, more flexible, more immediate. Behind the front lines, specialized reconnaissance and commando elements began operating with a different objective. Not to hold terrain, but to deny it to the enemy by making it unusable. Among these forces were Australian units drawn from the Australian independent companies, later reorganized into commando squadrons. These soldiers were trained for movement in conditions where conventional support could not reach them. Their role was not to engage in sustained battles, but to operate in small teams deep in contested or enemy-controlled areas. Their effectiveness came from three factors. First, mobility. They could move through jungle terrain without relying on roads or established routes. Second, concealment. They were trained to remain undetected for extended periods, observing enemy movement and infrastructure. Third, autonomy. They operated with objectives rather than step-by-step instructions, allowing decisions to be made at the point of contact rather than delayed through command chains. This autonomy became critical in New Guinea because the terrain punished delay. A report sent today might describe a supply route that no longer exists tomorrow. A planned interception could become irrelevant if the enemy shifted movement patterns overnight. In this environment, intelligence had to be acted on quickly or it lost value entirely. Japanese logistics were particularly sensitive to this pressure. Supply lines into forward positions were narrow, often dependent on predictable movement corridors through jungle valleys or ridge paths. These routes were not heavily fortified. Instead, they relied on obscurity and the assumption that deep jungle provided natural protection. But this assumption was increasingly challenged. Australian patrols learned to read movement patterns, disturbed vegetation, repeated traffic, temporary camps, and the subtle signs of organized logistics activity. Over time, they became capable of identifying not just enemy presence, but enemy dependency. And dependency is always a weakness. A force can adapt to loss of territory. It can recover from tactical defeat. But disruption of supply affects everything simultaneously. Ammunition, food, reinforcements, and morale. By late 1943, the Allied commanders recognized that small unit actions behind Japanese lines were producing effects disproportionate to their size. Even limited interference with supply routes could slow entire operational sectors. This was not always recorded as major battles in official summaries. Often, it appeared as fragmented reports, ambushes, destroyed stores, delayed convoys, unexplained shortages in forward positions. But on the ground, the impact was real, and it was cumulative. It is within this environment where terrain controls visibility and small units control disruption that a six-man patrol becomes operationally significant, not because of their size, but because of what they are positioned to touch. A supply line that cannot tolerate interruption, and a jungle that does not reveal its intentions until it is already too late. 2. Context/background was Section 2. By late 1943, Allied operations in New Guinea had entered a phase where the battlefield was no longer defined by front lines, but by contact points that shifted daily. Forward Japanese positions were often sustained not by heavy industry or mechanized logistics, but by an extended network of human movement. Porters carried ammunition and rice through jungle tracks. Small river crossings were used to shift supplies between isolated garrisons. In some areas, cargo moved in stages, handed from one local route to another, because no single route could support long-distance transport reliably. This system worked only under one condition: continuity. If movement was uninterrupted, even slow supply lines could sustain isolated units. If movement was broken, even briefly, the system fractured. That fragility became increasingly apparent to Allied intelligence units operating in the region, including reconnaissance elements embedded within Australian formations and coordinated through broader intelligence structures such as the Allied Intelligence Bureau. The Allied Intelligence Bureau functioned as an umbrella organization combining coast watchers, signals intelligence, reconnaissance patrols, and irregular warfare elements. In New Guinea, its influence extended into jungle patrol operations that were not always directly visible to conventional battlefield reporting. Within this framework, Australian independent companies played a critical role. Their structure was intentionally small. Sections and patrols were designed to operate independently for extended periods, sometimes deep behind enemy lines. They were trained not only in combat, but in observation, mapping terrain, identifying movement patterns, and interpreting logistical behavior from environmental signs. A single track of repeated foot traffic could indicate a supply route. A change in river crossing activity could signal a rerouted convoy. A temporary camp might suggest forward staging rather than permanent occupation. This type of interpretation required time in the field and close proximity to enemy movement. It also required patience. But jungle warfare rarely rewarded patience in the traditional sense. Because in New Guinea, conditions changed without warning. Rain could erase tracks overnight. River levels could shift supply routes within hours. And Japanese units, when pressured, often withdrew silently rather than defending positions to the point of destruction. This created a dynamic battlefield where absence was as important as presence for Allied commanders, especially those coordinating larger operations under figures such as Douglas MacArthur. The challenge was integrating this fluid intelligence into structured campaigns. MacArthur's broader strategy of island hopping depended on sequencing, isolating Japanese strongholds, bypassing heavily defended areas, and advancing toward strategic objectives such as the Philippines. But sequencing required predictability, and New Guinea rarely offered it. This is where tension developed between large-scale operational planning and small unit field reality. At the operational level, movements were scheduled in phases: reconnaissance, preparation, coordinated assault, consolidation. Each phase depended on the assumption that conditions would remain stable long enough for execution. At the patrol level, conditions were never stable. A supply route identified in the morning could be empty by evening. A village marked as active could be abandoned before reinforcements arrived. Intelligence often had a short operational lifespan. This gap between planning and reality created space for independent action, not as a doctrine, but as an outcome of necessity. Australian patrol leaders operating in these environments began to interpret their mission objectives with increasing flexibility. If the purpose of reconnaissance was to identify enemy logistics, then observing a supply route in real time created an immediate opportunity. If the purpose of disruption was to weaken enemy forward positions, then delaying action could reduce effectiveness. In some cases, waiting for coordination meant losing the target entirely. This does not imply formal deviation from command structure. Rather, it reflects the operational reality of jungle warfare, where the speed of environmental change often exceeded the speed of your communication. Radio equipment existed, but was unreliable in dense jungle terrain. Terrain interference, distance, and weather conditions frequently degraded signals. Messages could be delayed, incomplete, or entirely lost. This meant that even basic coordination was not guaranteed. As a result, small patrols often found themselves operating in a narrow window of decision-making autonomy. They were expected to report, but also expected to act when reporting was no longer sufficient. This balance between obedience and responsiveness became one of the defining features of Australian jungle operations in New Guinea. It is within this environment that small unit actions against supply lines gain significance far beyond their scale. A single disrupted convoy did not just affect one location. It affected timing, reinforcement cycles, and operational readiness across entire sectors. And unlike conventional battles, these disruptions often left no dramatic record. There were no large engagements, no clearly defined victories or defeats, only delays, shortages, and silence where movement was expected. Which brings the focus back to the jungle track itself. Note, because somewhere within that system of fragile continuity, a six-man patrol is now positioned against something far larger than its size suggests. A supply flow that depends entirely on uninterrupted passage, and a decision point that cannot wait for confirmation from anywhere else. 3. Angles. Section 1. In New Guinea. Survival was not measured in battles won, but in decisions made under uncertainty. For the men operating in small patrols behind Japanese lines, the jungle was not a backdrop. It was the entire battlefield. Every movement carried risk. Every pause carried consequence. There was no safe distance from the war, only degrees of exposure. A six-man patrol moving along a supply route was not an anomaly in this environment. It was a product of it. These units, often drawn from formations such as the Australian independent companies, were trained to operate in conditions where visibility collapsed within meters and communication could not be guaranteed. Their effectiveness depended on restraint as much as aggression. Patrol movement was slow, deliberate, and silent. Foot placement mattered. A broken branch could carry further than sound in the still air. A displaced rock could reveal presence hours later. Even breathing patterns were adjusted in close proximity to enemy activity. This was not discipline in the ceremonial sense. It was adaptation to environment. In such conditions, endurance replaced structure as the defining factor of performance. Men carried their supplies across terrain that offered no predictable paths. Rations were limited. often supplemented only when contact with supply drops or friendly units was possible. Water sources had to be assessed carefully, as contamination and exposure were constant risks. Fatigue was cumulative, not just physical, but cognitive. Decision-making under these conditions required continuous assessment of incomplete information. Patrol leaders were not directing formations in the traditional sense. They were interpreting terrain, enemy behavior, and timing simultaneously. A supply track in the jungle was never just a path. It was a signal. Repeated foot traffic indicated logistical dependency. Fresh disturbances in soil suggested recent movement. Abandoned debris could indicate a shift in route or a breakdown in coordination. These details were not abstract intelligence inputs. They were immediate tactical indicators. And in many cases, they could not be reported in time to remain relevant. This is where the concept of initiative became operationally significant. Within jungle warfare, initiative did not mean disobedience. It meant responsiveness. The ability to act within the window of opportunity that the environment provided, rather than the window defined by centralized coordination. That window was often narrow, sometimes measured in hours, sometimes in minutes. From a tactical perspective, this created a persistent tension. Small units had the capability to observe and influence enemy logistics directly. But larger command structures required confirmation, coordination, and alignment with broader operational plans. Those two timelines rarely matched. On the ground, this mismatch became visible in the behavior of both sides. Japanese supply movement relied on continuity. Porters and small convoys followed established jungle corridors that were difficult to replace quickly if disrupted. When those routes were compromised, rerouting was possible, but not immediate. Delays in supply delivery did not simply affect frontline units. They affected planning cycles, reinforcement schedules, and the ability to maintain forward positions over time. In this sense, logistics was not support, it was structure. And structure in the jungle was fragile. For Australian patrols, this fragility was not theoretical, it was observable. A disrupted trail could be followed backward. A broken convoy could be tracked forward. Patterns emerged not from maps, but from repetition in terrain. But recognizing these patterns was only part of the equation. The other part was timing. Because once a supply route was identified, its value diminished with every passing hour. Movement could resume. Routes could shift. The enemy could adapt, which meant that delay itself became a form of risk. From a leadership perspective within patrols, this created a constant calculation. Report the finding and preserve procedural alignment. Or enact on the finding and accept operational isolation. Neither choice was without consequence. Reporting preserved structure but risked losing the target. Acting preserved opportunity but risked exposure. There was no universal correct answer, only context-dependent judgment shaped by experience in the field. This is why jungle operations increasingly relied on small unit autonomy, not as a rejection of command structure, but as a response to environmental conditions that made rigid sequencing difficult to maintain. At higher command levels, this autonomy was often understood but difficult to fully integrate. Operational plans required synchronization across multiple units and support systems. Air support, artillery coordination, and infantry movement were designed to operate within defined windows of time. A deviation at the patrol level could affect that entire structure. Yet without that deviation, many opportunities would simply disappear. This tension between structure and immediacy defined much of the operational character of New Guinea warfare in 1943. And it is within that tension that 6 men find themselves positioned against a supply system that